speakers, and thank you for the audience that is here with us so late. And this is now your chance to ask your questions. And here I already see questions. So let's begin with Jose and then Constantine.
Yeah, thank you. This panel really was about claims and identity, and what is one claiming when one is claiming compensation. I won't ask any question to Iris. So I have questions to Regula Ludi and to Joanna Silva. I want to ask you, Regula, the case that you elaborated on, the man who writes that he is no bittsteller, that is no supplicant. It's a very subtle one, because he doesn't actually oppose his official identity, which is one of a claimant. He opposes something that he thinks is implicit in the way he's being treated. Would it be possible to oppose the position of claimant and still claim? Did you see other strategies of opposition? Because this is a kind of a particular case where he is arguing against something that nobody has ever said, actually. So it's a strategy of opposition against something that has been left unsaid. I wonder whether you came across strategies where claimants argue against things that have been said and so on. So I won't elaborate, but I think it's a very rich field, and you kind of are dealing with one particular aspect of it, and so if you could elaborate. Joanna Silva, I was a bit confused by part of your presentation. First of all, you started by showing a slide that said restitution, but I think you meant compensation or indemnification. And then the figures that you showed, that there are more women than men in this age group, to make the claim that you made, which is that women survived the Holocaust more in larger figures than men, you would have to juxtapose these figures with the general population, because I think in this population of the elderly, also among other people who are not Holocaust survivors, 57 to 42% or something like that, I think is the general figure in the general population. So I'm not sure the Holocaust actually comes into that. And then the main point I want to make is that you presented these payments of 2,500 euro that were made in these two funds. In my response to Konstantin Goschler, I tried to distinguish three types of payments. Up to the end of the 60s, the logic of compensation was one of tort law. When the compensation was reopened in the 90s, the logic was one of social payments. But in the 2000s, it turned into symbolic payments. And even the official German authorities argue that these payments are symbolic payments. They don't say this is justice. I know the claims conference, I know Eizenstat says this provides some measure of justice, and you repeated that statement a few times. I would argue against that. I don't think this is any measure of justice. This is some measure of recognition. But there's a distinction between recognition and justice. Recognition is provided by a one-time payment. Justice, I really, really doubt the word is appropriate here. So I would have a completely different take on this. And I think this should really be, these three types of payment should really be clearly distinguished from each other, because they follow completely different types of logic. And so this brings me back also to Regula's paper, where I also think that the issue of strategies used, I'm fascinated by the attempt to use Althusser here, but the strategies used by claimants to oppose or to undermine the logic of the interpretation by the authorities, which for Althusser doesn't exist because he's a structuralist, but you don't seem to be one because you allow opposition. It's each time there's something different that is being opposed. Because with Joanna, we already have the point where she says they are claiming their identity. So it's a completely different logic that is at work, where it's a logic of recognition as opposed to a logic of tort law or a logic of social security being used here. So I think also these tragedies that you're talking about need to be historicized and placed in the particular historical context.
Do we collect questions or do we collect? Okay, so please, Konstantin.
So I can continue with appealing to historicizing. I think we also need to historicize somehow ourselves and our categories. And I would like to bind together the first three presentations, which really together give a fascinating picture, because they all work with similar concepts. So there is confession, innocence, and innocence. And so how does this belong together? And what I see is you describe a shift. So the first two papers, which deal with confession and innocence, are based on an idea, I would say a little bit ironically, victims with attitude. While the third paper shows us a different picture of a victim. So this is the innocent victim. These are children which are the symbols of innocence. So there's a shift referring to the image of the victim. So what makes it? So what characterize? What do we expect from a victim? And this is related, in my opinion, with another shift. The shift from attitude to suffering. So the quality of a victim is that he has suffered and not that he has shown a certain attitude. And so we need to be aware of these general shifts when we make our judgments, because it's very easy to scandalize early indemnification when we use the measure stick of suffering and of the innocent victim. But so this is fair, we can use this moral standard, but we need to realize that these shifts are dependent from wider historical developments. So what is the price if we use the innocent victim as a measure stick? This is a victim without agency. This is pretty close to the definition of the victim and the within our understanding of genocide, which means a victim is somebody who has no intention within a historical process, and insofar focusing on kids must be and children must be seen as the result of a historical process and as also as a result of historical conflicts. So children as Holocaust survivors or as victims emerged for the first time in Eastern Europe because their especially forced laborers were considered as collaborators, as Nazi collaborators in their societies. And therefore they shifted to children survivors because children naturally are considered as innocent. So there's a flip side to these developments, and we should not just take these so the values which are underlying to these descriptions on face value. So we should ask, what does it mean that our concepts of victims do change, that our definitions do change, and how are they related to struggles in certain societies at particular times? And so that's something which I'm still missing a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like.
You don't want to collect all. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Jose and Konstantin, for these comments. Is it on? Okay. Okay. Of course, you find the claimants who don't want to be claimants in the press, in all the debate, in the discussions. It's hard to find them in the files because if they don't want to be claimants, they normally don't file claims. Oh, okay. They don't file claims, or they don't voice that, and so that's why I use this one example where you can actually show how somebody kind of uncovers the hidden messages that are within the practices, and the kind the expectations that are associated with the practices. So it's just a suggestions for a methodological approach to reparations files or compensation files that can give you also a bit of a different view. And as I said, it's not about red tape. It's not about making judgments, as Konstantin Goschler suggests, but it's just about looking from a bit of a different perspective at what actually happens in the operation of compensation. And maybe just as a follow up on the innocence and victim issue, I don't quite understand what you mean with victims with attitude. You will have to explain that to us. But what I think is really interesting about compensation practices is to see how the idea of victimhood and of innocence are being developed through reparation or compensation practices, and how in all these also the negotiations in the compensation practice, ideas of victimhood, of innocence emerge. And so there you actually have to or whenever you're using these concepts, you have to historicize them. You have to see in what contexts do they appear, and what significance do they have at the time. Of course, I mean, that's what we are historians for.
Thank you so much for the comments. This is why events such as this one, such as this conference, are so great, because we can discuss these ideas, test them out. And as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. So I am taking diligent notes here on how to incorporate them into the project. So thank you for that. So in terms of the concept of justice, right? So this is the definition. How do we define justice, right? And who gets to define it? So of course, at the claims conference, we use the phrase, that we secure a measure of justice, because it can never be a full justice. We discussed this throughout, from yesterday, today, right? So it's a measure, a small measure, actually, that's what we say, a small measure of justice. Recognition. Of course, this is a recognition that two funds, the Child Survivor Fund, the Kindertransport Fund, are a form of recognition of the suffering that these children endured. So we can, go on into a discussion, but it's a very important distinction, and thank you for that. But on the one hand, this is the institutional phrasing, and there are people here at this conference who can explain it much better than I can, why we use this term, right? And to Professor Goschler, this is a very interesting issue that you raised about the process of how child survivors became child survivors, became identified as child survivors. It was an entire process. So really, without going into much detail, I will just say that in 1991 was when the major conference took place in New York of the hidden child. And that's really when many children, began to understand that they have shared experiences, that they are survivors. Because until then, many children were told, or they thought, they internalized this, that their experiences didn't matter, that they didn't have memories, what could they know? They were so young, right? And so this conference really galvanized the efforts of the child survivors. And since then, there were so many other organizations, local organizations that mushroomed throughout the world, right? So definitely was a process. So 1991, and then the study that I mentioned was 1998. So only 7 years later, right? So we can see this is very recent. The child survivor self-definition and identification.
Iris, do you want to say something?
I would like to say something. Konstantin, in your question, you mentioned and talked about the innocent victim. I'm not sure if this was your intention, but when it comes to Israeli claimants and this whole process in Israel, well, then you touch here upon a very sensitive and political issue. I don't want to go into philosophical discussions on innocence, but because you mentioned the term, I have to add that when the talks in Wassenaar went on, Jared and Jacob Robinson had plans to compensate Palestinian refugees. So Jacob Robinson, Jared, and many others were in a difficult situation. They were victims, the Holocaust. On the other side, they represented Israel's policy, and interestingly, they used the terms used in the Wassenaar negotiations in order to develop plans to compensate Palestinian Arab refugees from the 1948 wars. Terms such as refugees, integration, humanitarian cases came up in both cases. And to make this story even more complex, the case of Israel was about integrating refugees, penniless refugees. For the Palestinians, it was also the question of integrating penniless refugees somewhere else into the Arab states. In both cases, it was not about bringing the Jews back to Europe or bringing the Palestinians back to Israel. And the story is so complicated because there was a third case, namely the ethnic German expellees. And here we have the same terminology and the same dynamic, namely paying refugees money, penniless refugees, in order to ease their integration into a new society, into a new state. So I would assume that this was not your attention when we spoke of innocence, just to emphasize that this is a hugely political and sensitive issue in Israel.
Thank you. We continue with the questions, collecting questions. Ronnie, please. And he was first. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. As a professional working in this field for the Claims Conference for decades, I want to little bit side comment on Iris Nachum, because, and it's really part of a history that with a starting point of the BEG. The BEG was one of, I would say, the most restrictive programs you can ever imagine. And if we wouldn't have the development after the reunification, we would be in a very, 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 very poor and sad situation regarding Holocaust survivors. So, as I saw also the movie yesterday, we are a little bit in this Adenauer narrative, and this is really totally wrong regarding the BEG. So, but to switch between the federal burden law and the BEG is a little bit of a mistake, because if you look at the BEG is a genuine compensation identification program, right? And it is made mainly for German Jews, right? That was the starting point. But the other law, which passed in August 1952, was something totally different, an inner German law, which was, the aim was you had on the one side people who suffered not from the war and people who suffered from the war. And I appreciate very much what Benny did, and for sure Ernst Kastenstein, to throw the foot in the door, yes, and so to open this German unification, German, yeah, you are the refugee from the East, yes, right thing. But it's totally different to the DSK in the context of a BEG. And I hopefully you can agree, and I want to add this because it is a little bit, if you switch between the compensation program for persecution, where you have to prove that you are part of this German thing, and the other thing which was originally not meant. And this is also part of a history that the Claims Conference successfully, and also other lobbyists in this group, tried always to find ways to put a hole in different issues. And the last thing in this case was the so-called Ghetto-Rentenprogramm, yes, where you can join in the German pension system. So it's a little bit different if you talk about genuine indemnification programs, and on the other side, this what I call look for opportunities to get the Jews in a boat which is originally not in the eyes of the Germans meant for Jews.
Ronnie.
Iris, you mentioned that no, I won't. Don't worry. You know me. No, no. I just wanted to ask about the BEG authorities, which you mentioned. If you can elaborate and explain, because what you said, that as I understand it, there were different interpretation. Maybe, I'm not sure this is the right, what you meant, that it was different interpretations of the law or different implementations of the laws. Can you explain how was it possible? And was it connected to, I understand, connected to lenders? And so they have different, but the law was, it was of the federal. So can you explain the difference between the agencies, the BEG authorities of the lenders?
I want to intervene with a question to Iris and to Regula, to juxtapose your presentation, because Regula was talking about how the definition and how the practice is influencing the identity of the claimant, and I wanted Iris to reflect whether all these tests and questions, were there just, in your opinion, bureaucracy, or did it just reflect a pre-identity, or did it change something through this practice about the identity of the claimant? And to Regula, the opposite question, because you are taking a Butlerian performative understanding of how much of it is the identity is original, and how much of it is part of this process of becoming a subject, becoming a claimant, right? So to reflect how much are you willing to go with the Butler understanding that the process is creating, because you are saying that they oppose it. They oppose from which subject position. So, okay.
Thank you. Very quickly, I want to bring in Gustavo. with his paper, because I think we should benefit from the opportunity that we have someone, as you said, basically restitution and compensation has not been much discussed for Latin America. And I'd like to ask the slightly provocative question. I'm very happy that you do this, but can you maybe very briefly say how this will actually change our picture of what we know so far? In the new title of your talk, you mentioned class, and I think that might be something to explore a bit further. And yeah, maybe just a last observation also, we haven't made something out of it, but this Jewish man who returns to Düsseldorf, I mean, he's going away from Allende, so apparently looking for more political stability in the Federal Republic, as he's afraid of socialism in Latin America, and maybe this political dimension in many countries there should not be completely out of the picture. Thank you.
Thank you. There was
So first of all, thanks very much for a very interesting panel and presentations. I have one question for Joanna and then a more general question for everyone who wants to answer it. For Joanna, I'm fascinated also by this construction, let's say, of the child survivor. And I genuinely don't know to what extent was this connected to a different way of understanding the development of the child, which was going on perhaps in parallel, but completely unrelated to the kind of documents, because the way also as society in which we look at children has changed with the time, but I think also really the understanding of child development, including that of the traumatic experience. And this is the link to my second question, so the broader one in general, because you all mentioned papers and interviews, and something that I was surprised not to hear was the word trauma, because I feel that in many of these bureaucratic, inadequate in many ways, sort of documents, procedures and laws, that's the dimension which is impossible to mediate, and that somehow this is also what these documents give back to us. So I was wondering whether you could reflect on this. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the last question.
I would like, in a way, to continue to follow up Lorena's remark and question with you, Joanna. I wonder if you could draw any conclusion or insight from dealing with children of the Holocaust that bring us as close as possible to the second generation. You mentioned something about the impact on the children, the Holocaust of the children. Could you say anything at all about possible impacts on the second generation?
Okay, so back to the panelists. Maybe we'll start the other way around. Gustavo.
Thank you, Professor Siemens, for your question. I will try to be very brief. I agree with you that, especially in the area of class, might shed light some. I would say, brief response. This might shed light on the importance of local contexts for the reconstruction of this transnational story. In other words, for instance, the issue of the pensions. That money could be very little money in the US, in Canada, or other places in the North Hemisphere. In Latin America, that was good money and made a change in this regard. But honestly, I'm just starting with this, with my own quest, this academic quest. So for the moment, I would say that I'm interested in reconstructing this transnational story to contribute with this piece of the puzzle. But I will respond that. Thank you.
Okay. So you, sir, your questions. I think there are a few misunderstandings. First of all, both PAG and Lastenausgleichsgesetz were in the German laws. In both cases, it was compensation from Germans to Germans. Second, the Lastenausgleichsgesetz is a compensation law, as the law itself says, Entschädigung. Third, the Jewish negotiating teams, the claims conference, did not push itself to get into the equalization of burdens law. Believe me, the claims conference had experts on the equalization of burdens law. By the way, if you're interested in doing research on the equalization of burdens law, go to the archives of the claims conference. There are the experts on this law. They never pushed, they never asked the Germans to be compensated through this law. It was an offer by the Germans. And the claims conference in Vashem accepted it. Okay, then on your question regarding is it an implementation or an interpretation when it comes to the level of the lender, the local level? It's an interpretation and an implementation. We were quite astonished, Jose and I, when we saw that the lender had some sort of autonomy when it comes to the implementation of the BEG. And the case I showed to you, well, this is a local initiative. And so these initiatives varied from the lender to lender, but Jose and I have to do much more research on this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I asked this question because I saw one of the documents which about a meeting of Goldman and Adenauer together with representatives of the lenders, and Adenauer gave a speech there, and he told them that they are not kind of implementing the law. I mean, that there are differences between the lenders, and they should do it. So that's why I asked this question.
And Leora, your question regarding if the identity of the claimants changed throughout the process. Wow, this is a very interesting question. I would say that, and your question was also if they try to reconstruct an older identity, right? I think that it is very interesting to see that very often these claimants, especially under the equalization of burdens law, because when it comes to the equalization of burdens law, it's about property, it's about money, it's about houses, it's about factories. So it is in fact, but I've never thought about it before, it's in fact about reconstructing a bourgeois identity. So it's more about class than about culture or nation in this sense.
Okay, so I will be very quick. Thank you so much for these questions. They are excellent questions. There is so much to say about this, and there is rich scholarship on the topic. So very briefly, in terms of the construction of child survivors, the concept of child survivors, the identity of child survivors. So of course that was a process in terms of the development of childhood and how that played into developing this identity. For sure, for the researchers who are working on this topic, for sure that played a role. But I would just like to draw attention to some other developments that played a role in the emergence of this identity of a child survivor. I mentioned Sarah Moskowitz. She was the precursor of meetings with child survivors in the California area, of leading therapy sessions, group therapy sessions with survivors to help them understand what they went through, and that these child survivors realized that they were child survivors of the Holocaust, just as their parents had been, who had been in ghettos and camps, but these children survived because mostly they were in hiding, right, or living under a false identity somewhere, of course, in ghettos and to a lesser degree in camps. But academic work also played a role. In 1983, it was the first book that came out. Sarah Moskowitz wrote it. It was a collection of stories of several, I think 24 child survivors of the Holocaust. And that book really brought child survivors to the attention in the West. In 1991, the first academic book comes out by Deborah Dwork, Children with a Star. And this changed the entire field in Holocaust studies and how we study victims and victim groups. In terms of trauma, it's such a fascinating question. And I just mentioned traumatic experiences in my presentation. I didn't really go into that. I mean, when it comes to claims submitted to one of the funds at the claims conference, and this was mentioned before, I think yesterday in some of the presentations, that we really try to minimize the triggers that these applicants could sustain. And so, of course, some of the histories that the child survivors submit are more detailed. Some of them are just a few sentences. We don't conduct oral histories with the survivors unless it's absolutely necessary, because that's a trigger, right? And we understand that they are recalling their traumatic experiences. We don't want them to relive that trauma if they don't have to, if we can look for documents elsewhere to support the claim. In terms of the the child survivors and the impact of their experiences and memories on the second generation, that's a fascinating topic. We can talk so much about this, and there's a lot of research on the second generation, and also groups, right, for second generation. I'm familiar with the ones in the US. And here we're also moving into the direction of the third generation, having groups and meeting together and discussing their traumatic experiences of growing up in homes with second generation parents. So I think this is an emerging field in area in Holocaust studies, and we need to know more about the influence of growing up in a survivor household and how what impact that had on the second generation and third generation.
Your question about identity, maybe I have to return to Slajamovic. There was one quote she cited from her mother. Her mother refused to claim reparations until the compensation program for forced laborers came up. And her rationalization of that decision was that she didn't want to claim compensation as a victim. She didn't want to claim compensation as a survivor, but she would claim compensation as a worker. And I find that a really interesting justification and explanation of her decision. So that somehow links the whole question about reparations programs and what kind of identity do they expect claimants to subscribe. I think centers that or focuses the question on that. And does identity change? I think that's hard. That's hard to say. I think it's probably the only way to find it out is by doing the kind of research some anthropologists have done. And I think it's also important to consider identity as not as an essential concept, but as a concept that is contextual, that is changing over time, and that is multifaceted. And so it's always within an interaction with compensation agencies or whoever institution there is.
Thank you. With these words, we conclude this day and this session, and I thank really for a fascinating panel for our presenters.